Oh, I can.
All
Give
right,
me 1 second.
we're live right now on Wrestling Bookmarks. Another Thursday night. We have Anthony Tonelli coming to the. Did I pronounce your name, the last name right?
Yes, Tonelli.
Okay,
Correct.
perfect. Kenny will not be joining us tonight. He's got prior engagement. And tonight we'll be talking to Anthony about his career as a wrestler, and now he is a published author.
That's
which
right.
is pretty cool. So we try to bring the two to life here. And you were going to go grab a copy of the book so we can check it out, right?
Yeah, I just if you want, I can take a second to go grab it. I just tested myself.
Go ahead. Yeah, you can take a second.
All right.
I'll entertain everybody here. So I haven't sold off my collection yet, like I thought I was going to after Peacock decided to censor everything. I thought, you know what? Maybe I could just give up wrestling and just have it in the memory bank. Instead, I decided to hang on to the collection for a little bit longer. I bought all the DVDs that I needed to buy. I'm still looking for VHS tapes. If anyone out there has any VHS tapes of Primetime Wrestling, Superstars of Wrestling, Tuesday Night Titans, and I think those are the three that I'm looking for. Or any of the MSG clips from the 80s as well. I'm looking to buy VHS or DVD, and that way I could at least watch what I'd like to watch without the NBC network executives just telling me what I'm allowed to watch. So we have Anthony's back. Anthony, we were just talking about how Peacock told me that I'm not allowed to watch wrestling anymore.
Oh yeah, I that was one of those things where I was kind of surprised. I knew they were working on a deal with NBC, and I mean NBC owns USA, so I know they've had a working agreement for years. But I was a subscriber to WWE Network,
Me
and
too,
I was kind of taken by surprise when they said it was all moving to Peacock.
Yeah,
I was I didn't think that I thought they were going to put some content on there. I didn't realize they were going to move everything there and shut down the network.
Yep.
My understanding is that they'll have the entire library up there by August because they actually have to go through everything, and then it's going to take them forever to load it in. They have something on the order of like over 1 million hours of footage to go through and put on there.
They're censoring a lot of the content. Like you're just not going to be able to watch it.
Oh, okay. That I wasn't aware of.
Yeah. So that's some older wrestling fans like myself are not happy about that because we want to be able to watch the way it was and remember how insane it was back then, compared to today, what would be allowed, what wouldn't be allowed. But, it's one thing to put a warning up, I guess, if people need a warning, but to actually eliminate complete matches is an atrocity.
What are they basing it on?
They're basing it on if it could be allowed in 2021, like Stone Cold giving the middle finger is now it's blurred, and some matches it's just cut from. Roddy Piper, WrestleMania 6, the matches go versus Bad News Brown. They just eliminated the match. It's gone. You can't watch it anymore. I think there was a couple other things too that they're doing. So.
Yeah, I remember that at the beginning of the Attitude Era, it was they started pushing a lot of boundaries, and they were able to get away with a lot of stuff if they put it on after a certain time.
Because, that's right. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah,
because according to the FCC, if you had a minor watching the end of Monday Night Raw at 11 o'clock at night, ideally there would be parental supervision. But to put it on at the beginning of the show, kids might still be watching. So I remember DX did a whole promo where they let everyone know between the hours of 9 and 10, you'll see this, but not this. And then after 10 o'clock, you'll see this, and we'll be able to use these words. They did it as almost like a parody, but it was actually to inform people that in order to comply with standards and practices, they had to move the more mature content to a later hour that your 10 and 12-year-olds weren't repeating the stuff the next morning at school. And that's how they got away with it. And then, but now on demand, everybody would have access to it, including those kids, middle of the afternoon, whatever. So I guess NBC's just trying to protect themselves from, hey, you're just putting anything out here, and that might have been cool back in the day, almost at midnight, but now you're giving anyone access to it. So they probably had lawyers saying to them, listen,
Oh, of course.
In order to protect our own thing, we have to make sure this stuff doesn't air. So I on that end, I get it, but I see what you mean too. We saw all this stuff when it happened, so to go back and watch one of the WrestleManias, whatever, and to not see a match that we know was there was
it's crazy. It's kind of funny. All right, so you were so you have a wrestling background.
Yeah.
How long did you wrestle for?
Straight through for about a decade, about 9.5 years.
How did you get into that?
I was living in Pennsylvania at the time, and I went to an event. I had been a fan since I was a kid. I grew up in New York City, and Saturday nights on Channel 9 at midnight was like a religion. We'd always stay up late night Saturday night to watch WWF. It's the only thing that came in back in the territory days. And so I always liked it, and I kind of started getting back into it in the mid 90s. And I thought, this would be kind of fun to try. I've always wanted to try, it'd be kind of cool. And I went to an indie show, and I met the late Captain Lou Albano.
Okay.
And I spoke to him for about 15 minutes, and he said, they're not looking for the big guys anymore. They want, shorter guys. I'm about 5'10", so in terms of everyday walking around, I'm probably closer to average height. But if you think of wrestling back in the day, these guys were all huge. And he said to me, they're not looking for that anymore. They're looking for guys that can move a little bit better, short guys. They're looking for more variety because a lot of the older guys, they're also breaking down a lot more often. They had a lot more injuries.
Yeah.
So he said that to me, and it kind of made sense. I said, I'll give it a shot. And I started training with this guy who lived in town, who was a wrestler, and then through him, I was able to get on. My first match ever was on January 3rd, 99. It was in a battle royal, because a lot of times the new guys, that's kind of where they put you until you feel comfortable being out, on your own. And I started doing that, and the very last match I did was actually last January 2020. In Rhode Island. But I've been lucky enough to wrestle in every state on the East Coast, from Massachusetts down to Florida.
Really? Okay.
And Puerto Rico.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool. And did you ever wrestle with anyone, on any of the cards that we may have known?
Sam Fatu.
Okay.
The absolute most painful chops you will ever receive.
Oh yeah.
I wanted no part of that after that. And he was we were super cool after that. I understood it. But he's a big, strong guy. He's one of those guys that I don't think he actually knew his own strength. He was super strong. He didn't look that strong, but he really was. And when he chopped, he laid right into it. There was no selling involved or anything. You felt it. The whole arena heard it.
Yep.
Yeah, and my chest was all. I had his fingerprints on my chest for like a day and a half.
Wow. So what was your day-to-day like during this your wrestling period? Were you wrestling 7 days a week, or did you have another job at the time?
Oh, I had another job. I'm a professional bartender by trade.
Yep.
And the beauty of that was I had a somewhat flexible schedule. So most of the places that I worked at, I was able to kind of set a schedule where I could work around it. So if I knew that I was going to be at the wrestling school getting training on like a Monday or Tuesday night, I'd be able to set up my schedule so that I'd have that night off and be able to go do my training. And then there was, because of the way the industry is, there was always someone who wanted to pick up an extra Friday or Saturday. So if I had a show that week, and for a while I was on cards every single weekend.
Yep.
I'd be able to trade it up for like a Tuesday or a Wednesday. It might not have been as lucrative, but it opened up my schedule. So in that sense, it was actually very helpful. So yeah, I had that was my shoot job. I did that for years. And because of that, I was able to wrestle on a regular basis at times when I wasn't making much money in wrestling, but this opened it up for me, opened up my schedule to allow me to do both, earn a decent living and be able to wrestle.
Oh, that's cool. Now, who are some of the guys that you may have looked up to?
Names or like indie guys that I worked with?
Yeah, no, like the names growing up.
Biggest one was Ric Flair. Ric Flair was the reason I wanted to be a wrestler.
Yep.
Just the cool demeanor. I knew from day one I always wanted to work as a heel, always.
Mm-hmm.
And of the 9.5 years, I did a solid 9 years as a heel. It's always what I felt more comfortable with, and my style was very different from what he did in the ring, but a lot of the swagger, the attitude, and all. I remember seeing him. I'm like, that dude was like super super cool. So I really dug him a lot. Roddy Piper was another guy that I really looked up to as a kid, especially on the microphone. He was so entertaining. He was so. It looks like anything that you would throw at him at the moment's notice, he'd be able to work with it. He'd just be improvise so quickly and make everything entertaining. So those were like two of the main guys. There was a lot of dudes that I kind of thought were really cool. My first finisher ever was a DDT because I had the utmost respect for Arn Anderson. Arn Anderson was like, to me, he was for years, he was the man. It's like, it was Flair, but I loved watching Arn Anderson work. So that's why I used the DDT. And he was always the first guy in war games. And I was like, yeah, if I ever do war games, I want to be the first guy in like him, because that seemed to be like the guy that had all the fun. Once it got too crowded.
What did you prefer, NWA or WWF back then?
NWA, probably because I grew up in New York, and NWA was more like the foreign one. Like, it was from the South and in the Midwest. WWE, I liked a lot. But the guy that I really rooted for worked in NWA. So I started watching on TBS. I would watch Championship Wrestling. Literally, the show was called World Championship Wrestling.
Right.
Tony Schiavone was the host for a while, and that would be on like Saturday mornings on TBS. So I had my schedule done really well because they worked it out. The networks worked it out really well. WWF Superstars was on at 10 in the morning. NWA was on at 11, and Glow was on at 12, and then at 1 o'clock. And then at 1 o'clock was AWA. It was Vern Gagne's territory after that. So I was lucky enough to get to watch all of them, but there was just something so cool about that, about the promotions down in the Carolinas where the Four Horsemen were based in, and guys like Dusty Rhodes, and like that era to me, Ivan Koloff. That era was, to me, what made me want to be a wrestler.
Now, did you collect any of the merchandise back then at all?
Not really. I had a couple of the action figures, but when I got them, they were already secondhand and they weren't in great shape. And then I eventually passed them on. However, when they had the those ice cream bars, I collected a ton of them. I collected a ton of those. Unfortunately, I used to love those things.
Oh man, I love those things too.
I got the Piper one. Yeah,
I would pay a lot of money to be able to eat one of those right now, like one from like the 80s. Like if someone had it in their freezer.
You know what? Someone probably does have it. It'd be great.
I wonder if I could find that on eBay. One of the a box of the ice cream bars. They could ship it to me in dry ice.
You could try it. You're a brave man. I don't know if I would try that after 30 years, but
I got a box of 85 Topps baseball I opened the other day, and I ate the bubble gum. So
nice. With the gum, I probably would have done it too, because I remember getting
35 years old.
I was into baseball cards when I was a kid, and to tell you the truth, the gum never tasted like it was fresh anyway. It was always like a hard piece of bread. I'm like, how much harder can it possibly get? It's probably not any worse than it was when it first came out.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All right. So what drove you to want to write a book? What's the book called? Let's see it.
The book is called Legacy.
Okay.
And it's set up as book one of the Dominion series, where it says they're not for resale. What they sent me was the proof copy.
Yep.
So that's what it says that. But basically, it is science fiction. It's sci-fi with historical fiction, and the premise of the story is it takes place. Good part of the story takes place in colonial America in New York.
Yep.
And it involves a guy who's this Dominion has got the ability to send people through time, and they have sent someone. His name is Cleon Strong, and then we find out in the book that he's actually someone named Cleisthenes. Now, for anyone who studied history or political science, Cleisthenes was the Greek guy who invented what we now know as democracy. The idea of one man, one vote was Cleisthenes. So I've actually taken that character and created a modern version of him where he basically in this case, traveled back to the US to help the founding fathers create America. But naturally, as these stories usually go along the way, there are quite a few hiccups. It's a dangerous thing. And then what happens is the machine that sent them there breaks. And they can't be brought back right away. So they have to figure out, the whole point is they have to kind of figure out how to win this war, how to stay alive, and then figure out how are they going to get back home, which, by the way, is in the 22nd century. Mm-hmm. So Cleon is a guy who was born 25 centuries ago, was brought forward to the 22nd century, and then sent back to the early part of the U.S., to give rise to the U.S., to help George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. And when I wrote it, those founding fathers are actually characters in the story.
How did you come up with the story? Did you have this in your head years ago and you were like, I want to put this to paper, or how did it happen?
I actually thought of it because my favorite sci-fi trope has always been time travel. It's always fascinated me, the idea that you could take someone who is, say like in our time frame, and then send them back in time, or even crazier, send someone from our time into the future. Mm-hmm. The guy that goes back in time has got knowledge of what has happened between the two time periods. The guy from this time is going forward and has no idea what the future holds. So that idea was always kind of cool. And I said, wouldn't it be cool if we found that there was someone that went back in time to help the founding fathers? Because I'm a history major, and I went extensively into reading about the founding fathers and the U.S. Revolution. And literally, when you look at the numbers, it was completely stacked against them. There's absolutely no reason the U.S. should ever have won that war, and yet they did. Yep. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to write a story where someone went back there and kind of behind the scenes helped them out? He wanted the same thing that they did, but he had to remain anonymous because, think about it, even nowadays, if someone says, well, I'm from the future, we really wouldn't believe him. We would say, oh, that guy's nuts. But in the story, that's actually who he is. And he goes back in time and helps to essentially foment a war that became the U.S. Revolution. And it's the reason we have the country we now have. So it was, when I first started writing this, it was supposed to be a short story. Mm-hmm. And an author who was kind of mentoring me along the process kind of told me, listen, short stories, or like collections of short stories, don't really move very well in terms of sales. People who can get away with that are established authors. If Stephen King puts out a collection of short stories, yeah, people are going to buy it. It says Stephen King, but where I'm new, he said, you're better off writing off something, a longer version. So the first chapter in this book is actually the longest chapter because it was the original short story. And once he explained it to me, I just continued writing. And over the next couple of months, I put in hours every day. It's my first time actually writing a book, so there was a lot of trial and error. But eventually, I was able to finish the book. The stories were always there. The idea was, the ideas were easy to write down. It's just the all the other aspects of it. I related it back to when I was a wrestler. The actual moves are one thing, but then you have to think of, the psychology, the timing, so on and so forth. So when I was writing, I used some of that same stuff. And as the story began to develop, I felt very comfortable, and it's just kind of started writing itself, so to speak. So it started out as a short story, and it evolved. And my wife was actually my editor. She read it, and my wife is not really a sci-fi fan per se, but she really enjoyed the story because there was a lot of elements that were not really sci-fi. Like I said, there's that historical fiction component to it. So she read it, and she says, I could see this being a series. So book 2 is I'm already about a quarter of the way in book 2, with the idea that there'll be the third one. The second one would be out this summer, and then to complete the trilogy, probably at the end of the year. And of all things, it's in large part thanks to COVID. Because I ended up being out of work for a while. So now I had the time to do this, so I just started writing last summer, and that, it's pretty surprised that eventually you look at, it's pretty cool to look at Amazon and see your name up there with a book for sale.
Cool. Have you ever been in a time machine at all?
Not per se. No. I'm
Have you ever traveled in time?
No.
Okay. I'm from the future, actually.
Okay, cool.
Not really, but what is your favorite time travel movie? There's only one right answer.
There's only one right answer?
Yeah.
Oh God. If I tell you what it is, it kind of gives away the ending, but I think at this point, most people kind of figure out. My favorite time travel, quote unquote, time travel film of all time is the original Planet of the Apes.
Whoa. Over Back to the Future? Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. I Back to the Future was cool. It was a comedy. I did enjoy it. I loved it a lot.
Are you talking the Charlton Heston version?
Yes.
Okay.
The end of that movie, that screenplay was written by Rod Serling, who is one of my sci-fi gods. Okay. Him and Isaac Asimov were my favorite sci-fi writers. And the end of the original Planet of the Apes, when you watched it, you're like, wow, this could have been an episode of The Twilight Zone, because it has that bizarre, ironic twist at the end. And then you find out, did you I don't want to ruin it for anybody.
When I was a kid, was there a TV show, Planet of the Apes TV show?
There was a TV show.
I thought it was on every day. I remember being on almost every day when I came home from school.
At that point, it's probably reruns. I think it ran like in the 70s. It never did as well as the movies did. But yeah, they had that, and they also had they had an animated Planet of the Apes too, for like a season or two.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. But it didn't do very well. But the original is still one of my favorite, because when I watched it, did you ever watch the original? I'm not trying to give away too.
I'm sure I did. I mean, I watched the Mark Wahlberg one. Does that count?
Yes and no. Yes.
I'm assuming it follows the storyline a little bit.
For what I'm gonna describe, yes, It does work. What I liked about it is that it when you're watching it, when you're first drawn into the story, it's a story that could be happening right now, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. And it's more of a commentary on society, which is what science fiction has done for years. And it's kind of one of those that kind of makes you think, what if the roles were reversed? What if we were the one in cages, so to speak? And so it kind of gives you that. But then the way Serling wrote the ending of that, and it literally, I remember when I watched it, it blows you away. And once you come to the realization, holy crap!
Now I have to go watch the movie.
You got to watch it, man. It's that thing. I would say.
Are you talking about the spaceship is there a spaceship at the end? Is that what happens?
Well, they quote unquote land on a spaceship. They're astronauts, and they
Right.
land
Okay.
on the Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
And then the end of the movie's got that twist that Charlton Heston gets off his horse and he's on the ground and he's screaming, because he's come to the realization of what has actually happened.
Yeah.
And it's one of those that you're like, holy crap! It's a phenomenal finish. So
Oh,
that for me rates it's my favorite time travel movie.
interesting. Now I'm gonna have to go watch the movie. You can give away the ending of a movie that's 50 years old. That's a lot.
Well, what happens is he finally he befriends another woman who is captive there, and he's on a horse, he's riding on a horse, he's making his way up a beach. He's finally out of the area where the apes are in control. He's riding up and he's thinking he's kind of getting away from them, and finally he can rest. And he looks out ahead of him and he sees something that just completely startles him. Now, when they did the film, they show his face, they show his reaction, and then they show like it looks like these points, and you're like, what the hell what's he freaking out about? And then as it pans out and it shows his angle, it was the Statue of Liberty collapsed on his side.
Okay.
Which means he was in New York, and you realize he never left. This was happening in the future. Somehow, as they were flying, they realized they're in the future. It didn't they basically traveled time without ever leaving the Earth. He thought he was on another planet. He had never left the Earth. He had just gone into the future. And when I saw that film, I'm like, holy crap, and so there's a lot of different sci-fi stuff that I really really dig, but that one always it's one of those endings that sticks with you, and because I was always a big fan of Serling, that one was one of those where I said, wow, that's awesome. So when I was going to write, my favorite movies growing up were mostly horror films, like horror and sci-fi, but mostly horror.
Yeah.
But I felt that it was easier for me. I felt more comfortable writing science fiction than writing horror. And it is two very different mediums, because when you read them, when you read or write them, they happen in two different places. When you are writing science fiction, most of it happens up here. It's your imagination. You're thinking, what could be. When you are writing horror happens deep in your chest. It's inside you, so it's whatever terrifies you is what works best. So it's two different approaches to writing. That's why it's very hard to ever see science fiction and horror be blended together, because generally they appeal to two different audiences. The only time that ever really worked well was in the original Alien, which is basically
Wait, wouldn't horror basically be science fiction, kind of? Anyway,
not necessarily, because if horror is supernatural, it would be something that happens essentially naturally. It's not machines, it's not technology,
right?
So every once in a while, though, you do have some crossover, and that's why the original Alien was, growing up, that was one of my favorite sci-fi films ever, because it was terrifying, but it happened in outer space. They basically took the idea of a haunted house and they put it on a spaceship out in deep space. And so sci-fi has always has always been my ever since I was a little kid. It was always something that I really enjoyed watching, because I thought it was so fantastic. To visit other worlds. I was a huge Trekkie, huge Star Trek fan of the original series. They showed it every night on reruns on Channel 11 in New York, and I every night I would stay up and watch it. I was so into that whole thing. I actually came to Star Wars later. I was a little bit older, and I said, well, I never really was into it when I was younger, so I started checking it out, and I'm like, oh, turns out they were right. This is actually pretty cool stuff.
So what were some of your favorite horror movies?
Favorite horror movie? The Hellraiser series.
Oh yeah,
especially the first two. Clive Barker he's got this way of creating this absolutely terrifying world, and it all exists inside his head.
Yep.
But he's a very cerebral guy, and he would write a lot of stuff that would take place in current day, like contemporary, but it was like always like that terrifying thing underneath that you didn't know.
Yep.
So the Hellraiser series was one of my favorite. The Night of the Living Dead I liked. I liked because it basically created a whole new genre. It was something that no one had ever seen before. Um, the subsequent ones I wasn't as crazy about. The original one, when you watch it now, just looks kind of corny. I mean, it was made on a low budget in 1968, but it was something unique and different, and it opened up. You wouldn't have the Living Dead without you wouldn't have the Walking Dead without Night of the Living Dead.
Right.
So the fact that it was so original and created a whole new genre, I really dug. Then came the era of slasher films, and to me that wasn't really horror. I grew up in New York City. A guy with a knife is not scary to me. But the one that absolutely shook me to this day is my favorite horror film of all time was The Exorcist.
Really?
Yeah, I
The
actually
one that
watched
always
that
got
film.
me was Nightmare on Elm Street Part 1. Part 1 to me is one of the scariest movies ever.
Yeah, I did
Well,
enjoy
because
it.
of the music made that movie.
Oh, the score.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big thing in all movies, but especially in horror films, with that music creates that suspense.
Right.
You could terrify someone without ever showing anything on screen, just the music and the ambiance
Yeah.
and the camera angles. So
How do you? Well,
yeah,
here's the
that movie
question:
had a lot of that.
Do you read horror? Do you
Yeah.
read horror books?
I have read, I think, about 30 or 40 Stephen King books, the old
I mean,
ones,
I can't
mostly
imagine
the.
getting scared from reading a story, like as opposed
Um,
to
if you,
watching it on the screen.
well, you know how people say, oh, they watched the movie, they read the book, and then they watch the movie, and they say,
Yep.
well, it wasn't the same thing, or they'll tell you, oh, the book was so much better. When
Yep.
you are reading it, right? When no one's presenting it to you, when you're reading it, it it leaves it up to your interpretation. So when they kind of try to describe a monster, you're imagining what terrifies you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it may not be exactly the same way that the writer thought of it, but
Yep.
it's your interpretation of what's terrifying to you. So, um, especially if you're reading it like, for a lot of people, if they read it at night when it's dark, whatever, they just have a light on. It just, kind of terrifies them. With movies, it's the sound and the camera angle and the lighting. That's all a big part of bringing that terror on the screen. But the original medium of horror stories was in books, and long before there was ever a film or television medium,
Yep.
Dracula scared the crap out of people for a couple of centuries in Europe,
Okay.
because they, we think of the modern Dracula, someone that's like, whatever they have, they usually have actors that are like really good looking, young, basically someone that that would seem attractive and you would like to engage with, but when that book was first written, there was none of that. And if you look at the original vampire movie, which was Nosferatu, that dude looked terrifying. He was bald. He had big bat ears. He had like 2 feet long fingers. He looked terrifying. And that's what people imagined when they read this book. When they read it, what they thought was, someone who's undead. So it's someone who came back from the dead or that you can't kill. So that alone terrified people. Back in those days, there was a very real fear of being buried alive.
Yep.
So, people thought, well, what if we buried someone that's alive and then somehow they get back and they come back for revenge? If they've been in that coffin for 5 months, 6 months, they're not going to look that same way. They're going to look like they're the Walking Dead, and so that for years terrified people. Both the story of a vampire coming back from the dead, and the idea that they would look like they had actually died. I would imagine that more people were terrified of reading that than they were when they saw it on the screen.
Oh, that's interesting. Like I can't imagine like watching because Jaws obviously was the book first, right?
Yes, yeah.
I can't
Eventually.
imagine watching that and getting scared, reading that and getting scared if I'm sitting in my living room. But if I'm watching it on TV with the music, the da 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 da, right, like that,
Right.
that will make you scared. But reading it in the
Well,
you can't get that in the you can't get that in the book.
you don't, but in the book, Peter eventually does a phenomenal job of creating the atmosphere for you.
Yep.
And what you see in the film, a lot of it is directly from the book.
Right.
I happen to live in New England now. I have for the past 20 years. And I've been to Cape Cod a lot of times. And I've been out at the beach when people will see things like seals. Sharks hunt seals. So when there's a lot of seals in the area, it tends to attract sharks, especially in the middle of summer when the weather's warmer. I've seen people run right out of the water because they see seals, and that means that there's sharks close by. So anyone that's grown up um, near the beach or anywhere near like shark infested waters, for them that's really that's really terrifying.
Yep.
What the genius of what Steven Spielberg did was when he did the film, he directed it in such a way where he actually put you there, which is what great directors do. They take the book and they say, okay, he describes it as this kind of town and this kind of in this state, whatever, and then they'll kind of recreate that for you and to kind of put you there. And the way he shot it was great because at the beginning of the movie, you just see legs. You don't actually see the shark until much later. You just see the legs, with blood in the water and people running out of it.
Yep.
And for anybody that goes to the beach in the summer, that's quite terrifying, especially if you go there with kids and your kids are out in the water.
Yep. Yeah, I could see that. That's interesting. So back to the book. What were some of the biggest challenges that you came up against?
Well, I knew, like a classic wrestler, I knew the beginning, I knew the middle, and I had a pretty good idea what the finish was going to be. The idea was, how do I tie everything together? I'm telling the story in two different time periods. The stories have got to mesh enough so that as people are reading it, first of all, they're well aware what century they're in, because you have to understand that there's a big difference between 1775 and 2275 in terms of technology, in terms of the language that they use, in terms of what's available to them, in terms of their knowledge of what the world is, what science is. So as I was writing it, I realized that as I was writing the parts that were in 1775, I had to try to write it as someone in that time period would speak. Most of the story is told through dialogue. I find it very comfortable to just be able to have the characters tell the story. There is kind of a narrator kind of thing, but that's just basically to kind of set up what's coming, and then the characters tell the story through dialogue. You find out what the story is. So that was hard because I had people who were time travelers who were, from a couple of hundred years in the future. They had to kind of speak the way people spoke in that time. Otherwise, they'd be outed. You could tell that they're not from there. And it wouldn't have seemed natural. They had to basically, almost like spies, kind of slip into that role and be that, do the spy gimmick. They had to follow. So for me, as I was writing it, I kept having to say to myself, how would someone in that time period say this? Or how far away is this from there? I wrote the story in Manhattan because that's where I grew up, so I knew it quite well, and I knew the history of it quite well. But there were still things that were very different a couple of hundred years ago. So I did a lot of research, as any good historical fiction writer would do. You do your research to find out who was where, what was available to them. I even at one time, I remember there's a part in the story where I'm conveying the amount of time that it took for someone to get from where the main house was in Washington Heights, down to the docks in Lower Manhattan. And I actually looked it up. I looked up how long it takes a horse and carriage to travel X amount of miles.
Did you really?
Just to
That's
be,
incredible.
yeah, because when you're telling historical fiction, the details are important.
I was going to ask you. I mean, how do you even come up with a setting for back then? You know, knowing like what the people wore, what they look, you know, what they look like, what the setting was going to be, what the weather was going to be.
I actually touch on every single one of those things because I researched everything. I researched the attire. I described the attire. I describe in detail. I try not to. When I write, I try not to bog the reader down with too many unnecessary details to clutter it up. But there are times when you kind of need those details to put the whole thing into context. So whenever that was necessary, I did research and I described what the inside of the main character's house looked like, because it was like a stately mansion, so to speak, in Manhattan in the 18th century. So a man of that station at that time had a certain type of house, certain size, certain decorum. He had staff, he had help. So I researched that and I incorporated that into the story. What the people were wearing was part of it.
Yep.
There's a character in there who's a girl who was very much part of the resistance, and oftentimes she dressed in men's clothing because from a distance, she'd be able. A lot of guys back then had longer hair, so the fact that she had longer hair wasn't really, no one really focused on that. If she looked like a guy from a distance, no one was going to really question it. They thought, oh, she's just hanging out with it's just one of the guys. And she did that because it helped with her cover, because a woman being that out in the open involved in a war was something uncommon at the time. Nowadays, and maybe in the future, we have tons, thousands and thousands of women that are in the service. But back in those days, that wasn't very common. So I described everything that she wore so that as the readers reading it, they realized what was the correct attire that most people would be wearing at the time. Because if it was something that stood out, then obviously she would have been spotted. She had to dress like all the guys did. So I described all of her attire. I described what the docks looked like. I've actually been on those docks, so I was able to describe that. I was able to describe what Manhattan looked like and all the different landmarks. There's a scene in which this girl takes a ride from Lower Manhattan all the way up, and in the story, instead of me just saying, "Oh, she made it from the docks all the way up to Cleon Strong's house," I actually write it. She's by herself. So what I do I wrote in italics, and those were her thoughts that she was thinking to herself. And it tells you the journey, it tells you like all the different parts of Manhattan that we now have come to know what they were like back then. So I took a lot. Part of it was doing research. For this next book that I'm writing, part of the story takes place in ancient Rome, and I did a lot of research as to what the politics were like, what the Roman daily life was like, what technologies were available, what didn't they have. So I did the same for Legacy, so that when someone reads it, it reads like something authentic from that time period.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And how long did it take to get the book out, to get the book finished?
Good question. The actual drafting of the book took me a couple of months. There was a couple of chapters that I just scrapped and restarted, just because I felt that there was something missing. And then once I had it done, once I had the manuscript finished, I turned it over to my wife, and she read through it. She edited for content and mistakes and stuff, and it was great because she actually had a lot of really good ideas that helped strengthen the story and helped it move along a little bit better. One of the things that writers always have to be careful with is to not get too married to your own story, so to speak, where you're like, oh no, it has to be this way because it's if someone, that's why they have focus groups. If someone kind of reads it back to you and says, what about this? And you're like, why didn't I think of that first? So she was kind of like my sounding board in that sense. She was very helpful in putting it together. But that took a while. Why?
Yep.
It was my first manuscript I had ever written, so there was a ton of mistakes in terms of formatting, in terms of, So I'm not the most tech savvy guy. I'm getting much better at it, but I was still learning how to write with modern technology, and
Yeah.
so there was a lot of stuff that we had to do. And then to put it on Amazon, you have to format it a certain way, both for paperback and for the ebook. There's two different formats that I had to use for it. So a lot of that kind of took time. So I started writing it in May of last year. I started writing literally on Memorial Day, and I wrote up until somewhere in the fall, and then I turned it over
Yep.
to her. It took her a couple of months to go through it and help everything, and then once I had to reformat it, then it took me probably about another couple of weeks to finalize everything, get the book cover done and stuff. So from beginning to end, it probably took about 8 to 9 months. But now that I know the system and I have a system in place, it'll go a lot smoother from here on out, because the first part is just when it's your first book and you're doing self-publishing, there's a lot of things that you don't know going in, and you just kind of learn it along the way. And the people at Amazon were awesome. I'd be able to call them up. They'd call me back, because you have to do a request. You
Yep.
call them up. Yeah, can you guys call me back? And they would call me back within a couple of minutes, and they
Really?
were very helpful. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
That's
Well,
incredible.
well, for that division, for the publishing division, if you actually are just like an Amazon customer that you just ordered something on there, I don't know how long it takes them to get to you. I haven't had a problem with them, but for this, they have a staff dedicated just to help the writers. So I'd get a call back, and they'd actually sit there with me and walk me through any formatting stuff that had to be done. So that was fairly smooth. So I've learned from all that. So now I know that it takes me about a solid 2 months, 2 months plus,
Okay.
that I can write this book in, because that's the actual writing time was about 2.5 months.
Yep.
And all the other obstacles that I had that were time consuming, I no longer have those. So this one took about 8, 9 months to, from the first keystroke to print. But it should be about 4 months for each of the other ones from here on out.
Well, I'll tell you what, the write up. I'm reading the write up on Amazon. It actually looks really interesting.
Yeah.
Now who did that write up? Did you do that?
Which is the blurb, like the description of the book?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I wrote it, and then again, my wife went over it with me. She tweaked a couple of things. I tweaked a couple of things. That blurb probably went through more rewrites than any other part of the book, because I knew how important it is. It's what people see. They go,
Yeah.
"Hey, what's
No,
this book
it's
about?"
really great. I'm thinking of how my normal job is I'm in sales, and
Mhm.
I'm always trying to craft emails. So it's really important to try to, grab someone's attention. But it does a really good job. I mean, I'm normally not someone who's into science fiction, but I think I would actually grab this book and read it.
I hope you do. I hope a lot of people do, because
Yeah,
again,
I think I'm gonna pick it up. I think I'm gonna pick it up.
no, awesome,
And
awesome.
honestly, it's nothing against like science fiction. I literally every book I own is nonfiction.
No,
Like I don't
I
have
get
that
that.
part of my brain that allows me to read to enjoy fiction for some
Right.
reason. But this one actually, I mean, I love that period of time. And it actually it actually does seem pretty cool.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah.
that whole idea.
Yeah, it is science fiction in the sense that there's time travel, but
Yeah.
I try to do my own thing, carve my own niche, and telling the story this way is a little different from what most traditional sci-fi is. But that's the way I feel comfortable telling the story. That's my
Right.
version of science fiction. So yeah, if you pick it up, first of all, that'd be awesome. Thank you for the support. But yeah, I really hope you enjoy it. And hopefully you enjoy that so much that when I come out with the second one in August, I can come back here and tell you about it, and you say, "Hey, that was awesome. I'd like to do it again."
Yeah, absolutely. Don't ghost us when you turn into like J.K. Rowling or anything like that.
No, 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 no. Listen,
Yeah.
I don't forget the people that helped me get there. Actually, it's something else that I learned in wrestling.
Yeah.
Um, I remember Mick Foley saying, not to me, but just to guys in general. I remember him saying, the people you meet on the way up are the same ones you're going to see on the way down. and he was relating it to a story that he had with Dynamite Kid, who was, he was one of the British Bulldogs. He was a huge star, and Mick was a young guy, and he wasn't really very kind to him. And then years later, Mick was the guy that was on top, and Dynamite Kid was trying to hang on. And he said he felt bad because Mick's a nice guy overall, but he said it taught him that important lesson. He goes, especially in an industry where the guy you're in there with, you got to trust him. You got to be able to take care of each other. So I learned that lesson there. And this is actually the first promo stuff that I'm doing for the book. Book came out on Tuesday, so this is like the first promo stuff. And I can't thank you guys enough for putting it out there and bringing me on and giving me a chance to talk about it and let people know about it. So no, man, when I become as big as J.K. Rowling, I'm not going to forget you.
That. So, all right, 2 questions here. Actually, someone wants to know: it's available in physical and ebook, like Kindle?
Yes, it is. It's on both. It's available. If you do the paperback, I think it's like 2 to 3 days. They have it down to. If you have Prime, you can get it like in 2 days. Otherwise, it's like 3 to 4 days, because the way it works with Amazon is print. It's POD, so it's print on demand. They don't print a whole bunch of the books and then hope to sell them. When someone orders it, they have it in their file. They just go ahead and print it. It's a phenomenal system, because that means that I don't have to pay ahead of time for any books to be published. They print it up on demand. And that's the way they work it. So yes, it's available. There's actually 3 different ways you can read the book. You can read it as a physical book. You can read it. You can buy it and put it on your Kindle. People who have Kindle Unlimited can actually read it. If you already have a membership, you can read it essentially for free. You're paying for the service, but Kindle Unlimited is it's almost like a virtual library. You pay for the membership, and then you can read whatever books they have available on there without having to pay anything extra, which is awesome. And they still find a way to monetize it for us, so we still, we're still making money on it. But for the readers, it's, for people that read like a ton of books all the time, it's a great tool. For the person who's looking to, read something just occasionally, then they can just get it right onto their Kindle. Or if they're old school and they prefer the book, obviously that's another option they have.
So, all right, one last question before you get out of here. If you could go either back in time or ahead in time, what year would you go to?
I've thought about this a lot. Part of the reason why I wrote this book is because I would love to go back to that time period. A couple of years ago, I went to the Smithsonian, to the National Archives, and I stood in front of the Constitution, the Declaration, and all that. And you kind of you feel something really cool and really special when you're in that room, watching these documents and understanding, what they mean. I share a birthday, April 13th, with Thomas Jefferson. So I always thought it'd be cool to go back and speak to those guys, speak to him, which is part of the reason why I put him in the book, because it was almost like what I would want to say to them. But then I think, how cool would it be to go 300, 400, 500 years into the future to see what we've done, what we've accomplished, or what we have failed at? I'm not sure. I think I would want to go back in time. But there's always something so interesting about going forward and seeing what's out there before we get to see it in our lifetime.
Yeah, no, that sounds pretty cool. Well, Anthony, thanks so much for coming on. And let's see, I'm gonna throw a link to it here. Let's see. Let me put the link in here real quick for people to. So we have the link in the comments. People want to go to Amazon and check it out. Is there anywhere else they can go to it, that they can go find it?
Right now, it's only available exclusively through Amazon.
Okay.
Within the next month or so, I'm looking at putting it on Audible for people who prefer to listen to their books.
Okay.
That will, I'll let you guys know so we can update anybody who follows it. And as of right now, it's exclusively through Amazon. But that may change in the future. But for now, that's where you have to get it at.
Now, will you go to any of the like a Comic-Con to try to promote it at all?
Absolutely. I already thought about that. I'm like, oh, they canceled this. I'm like, perfect. They canceled the Comic-Con from before. Maybe I'll be able to do one in the fall.
Yep.
By then I'll have 2 books in the series. So, and with a third one, the final part of the trilogy coming out soon thereafter. So yeah, I would love to do a Comic Con or more than one. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. I like that. I like that idea. I think you'll move some books. I think you're gonna do well. I think you're gonna do well with this one.
I hope so. Thank you.
Get the right people, reading it and promoting it. But I don't know. I think it could be something. It could be, you never know, right?
Thank you. Yeah, that's the whole thing. It's like a lot of guys, their first time out, they don't make a ton of money, but then it's like with everything else, like even with wrestling, it's like, oh, you start creating that buzz. Oh, have you heard of so and so? Oh, let's get them down.
Right.
And the next thing you know, you're getting booked on, in pretty big matches and stuff.
Right.
Everything starts small, so
absolutely.
So that's the stage we're at now, and you got in on the ground floor, buddy.
Nice. All right, Anthony. Well, hey, thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming on the show, and we'll see everybody next week.
Hey, thank you for having me. All right.
Absolutely.
And take care.
You can pick the book up. It's called Legacy, and you can find it on Amazon. So hopefully we'll be hearing more from Anthony.